Welcome to the Deep Talks podcast. This is Regulus, your host, and I'm interviewing Hunter Salazar. He has his own YouTube channel under the name Hunter Salazar. Is there a numbers after that?
Nope, just Hunter Salazar. If you type it in on Google or YouTube, you'll find me.
Awesome. Hunter is a practicing, would you call yourself like Hindu spiritual?
Yeah, specifically a Shakta, but I'm a Hindu, but there's all kinds of things that a Hindu could be. There's not a whole lot of rules like in other, I wouldn't even call it necessarily religion. I'd call it a spiritual path. But yeah, so I'm practicing Hindu, but I've gone into the magical community. I've done all kinds of magic, chaos magic, blood magic, but mainly I work with spirits and gods, and I also work with the Norse gods. But Ma Kali is my number one goddess. So that's kind of where I'm at as far as spirituality goes. And it's good to be on your channel, man.
Oh, man, it's all good. I appreciate having you, and thank you for your time. So you were talking about how the kind of like your beliefs is that everything is wombs and there's wombs all over the place, and that your goddess is like equal to the source for you. So can you go into more depth on that?
Sure. Yeah. Generally Shaktas or anybody who kind of has beliefs, honestly, in the Southern Hemisphere, if you study the different cultures around the world and different spiritual paths, you'll notice that when the further south you go, as far as the whole hemisphere around the earth goes, more goddess worship, more goddess focus. So even when we're talking about South America or Mexico, the Virgin Mary is so big. Even after everybody became Christian, the Virgin Mary is so huge, and that culturally transferred. But so Shaktas in general, they have a very, and kind of anybody with a more goddess-oriented mindset or view tends to view everything more as one. In Hinduism, it's called Vedanta. So Vedanta is believing that everything's a part of the same thing, and that ultimately Advaita Vedanta specifically believes that ultimately duality is an illusion, and it is only because of the clouding of the mind or Maya, or a lack of clarity, that things seem to be separate, and that time and space exists because of a lack of clarity or a lack of realization or a lack of enlightenment or moksha, which is liberation. But yeah, so kind of believe everything is one. Everything is not meant to be separate forever, and then time itself is an illusion. And we're caught up in it only because of the clouding of our minds, and our souls are trying to go back to that outer cosmic womb that is the source, that is infinite life, you could say. And we're working our way back there through kind of like this miasma of delusion and ignorance that Hindus called Maya. And even in Buddhism, Mara is kind of like the Satan figure or the delusion figure. But he's still very much Maya based. So you see some overlap in some of these traditions. Very different from patriarchal religions or spiritual systems, where there is a clear kind of hierarchy and dichotomy of light versus dark. And everybody will go to, like, there'll be a certain amount of people that go to a dark place forever. And then a certain amount of people who are good will go to a light place forever. And that clear separation consistently exists. And we see that happening first in, as far as like the good God, bad God thing, and then heaven and hell. We see that in Zoroastrianism, and then we see that kind of adopted in Christianity. But in Judaism, it's a little bit different. So we see a little bit of blending there. But yeah, that's just a general layout of kind of how I think about things.
From what I've seen about Judaism, they acknowledge that God is good and evil, the creator of all things. So it would stand to reason that an evil thing would also be created by the same person who created the good, right? I've always viewed the world as not dual also. It's very like, I think about it as an organized system. Like life evolves by becoming more complex, by increasing the amount of patterns that it has within it as a whole spectrum. And like we're now at a very like far down on the line of the chronological timeline of these things evolving and creating new energy connecting and creating new processes through its interactions. And so I agree. I'm just more of like a scientifically minded person personally. So for me, it's like I like to look at what are these forces in nature? How do these forces in nature interact? And how can we observe these forces in person? That way we can tie our spirituality to the world around us. So how have you had any experiences that have kind of like helped you bridge your spirituality with the world itself?
I I think so. Before I started studying Hinduism, I told you before we started recording that I kind of started with Buddhism back when I was like 7, because I realized that all the other kids at school, they were talking about Jesus and God in a way. I realized that they were copying their parents, and I also realized that they were forming their personalities by copying each other. And I remember thinking, like, how do I form my personality? And like, should I believe what my parents believe? And then I went to go ask my parents. I was in first grade, so I must have been 7. I have very clear memories about certain things that are interesting. But I remember going to ask my parents and they're arguing about something stupid. And then I realized like they probably don't know the grander truth behind everything. So I went and looked up all the different religions on dial up back then because I'm 32. So, but I looked up and then I started Buddhism. But it wasn't until I got to Hinduism many, many years later. Because the idea of different gods, I thought it was tribal. I thought it was beneath um, beneath science, beneath even the idea of like a one god. I thought it was primitive before I started to actually dig into Hindu philosophy and the reverence for science and the fact that we get so much math. The vast majority of the world's math comes and was birthed like in India, and they've had a continuous civilization since. But and scientists are revered. But when I started to dig into Hinduism, I started to see, wow, there's so much like down to earth scientific explanation about how energy becomes, how consciousness first forms in matter, then becomes life, and then evolves. And in Hinduism, Darwinian evolution exists side by side with spiritual evolution. They're not two separate things. They're happening at once. So this marriage between science and spirituality, once I realized how natural it was in Hinduism, I was like, this makes complete sense. Because naturally I'm a very logically minded person, and I don't and I despite doing magic and spirituality that seems very superstitious, I'm not a very superstitious person, and I don't believe things immediately. I I I think that 99% of even ghost stories are just people misremembering things or blowing things up or lying. And I look for proof constantly. That's why during a lot of my rituals, even in graveyards, I will be recording. So when something supernatural happens, like people who are watching, they don't know that I'm not just like altering a video or something, but I know. And then I go back and I look, and I'm like, oh crap, like this happened. But yeah, so I've had experiences where like supernatural stuff will show up in videos or will happen directly to me. But I think where I found my spiritual and philosophical home and combined this science and the logic of that I naturally am, and my parents are very logical, very scientific. When I it combined with spirituality for me in Hinduism. But yeah, I've had all kinds of experiences. I will say that I think that meditation, even if it's non-religious meditation, provides a remarkable amount of clarity. And there's been multiple studies that show that the brain literally grows like a square millimeter if you meditate a certain amount every day for like a month. Like your brain like grows naturally and like makes connections. So there's something very much appealing to both, the science of it, but also the spirituality of it and how it's in bed in the East. But yeah, so I've had a number of spiritual experiences, but philosophically, that's kind of where the marriage happened for me.
That's awesome. I am on the other side of the spectrum. For me, I'm very much so like Christian minded. Not so much like I honestly think that the invention of Jesus was a way to put the identity of man itself onto a platform to worship ourselves rather than the universe as God. And like so that's like the one thing I wouldn't say I'm Christian like, but I do believe the Christianity is a extension of the Greek mysteries, and that the like archaic priest class of Greece and like their natural laws and their natural like their scientific like growth that they created through their like philosophies and their scientists were extended through their religion. And then when you know, the worship of Christ came in, they basically married their beliefs through their Greek mysteries to the new religion that was coming in. And so I find a lot of my roots in the Greek mysteries that exist within Christianity and that type of thing. So for me, it's like there's a source, like the Hermes Trismegistus, there's the natural laws, there's the source, and then everything that all these laws have become from source as a natural like progression of time and space. But if we think about it, space is always expanding, so time doesn't actually exist. It's just the expansion of space that gives us the perception of time. And well, the way I see it is that, how do I put this succinctly? Like everything came from the same source, and then over time it's progressively gotten more complex, or as space has expanded, it's gotten more complex. And with this, there's necessarily going to become emergent properties that are more than the sum of their parts. And as time progresses, those emergent properties that are more than the sum of their parts are going to interact with other emergent properties that are more than the sum of their parts and create something that is greater than the sum of those parts. And I think that there's natural, like, we don't have scientific methods to prove the way that like energy flows inside of closed systems yet. And I think that a lot of magic is using our brains to pull this energy from these systems and then put it where we want it to go without having a specific physical connection to wherever where it's coming from and where it's going. Like for me, I've always considered rationality comes from the irrational, right? We created patterns through our minds based off of the world around us that we all consider to be irrational without having the patterns that we recognize to understand it. So basically everything is irrational, and rationality is just a system of measurements that we've created to be able to measure the world around us. So when we're using magic, using irrationality, we're actually being true to the world and to nature itself. We're not being stuck in our human minds, our human bodies. We're not processing the information through our own being. We're using what we think and what we know to try to create something with the world itself outside of ourselves. That's why I've always believed magic is very effective and very valid, because it gives you that connection to the world around you through your own like internal force.
Yeah, so we think very similarly. So I will say that so Christianity kind of evolved with like Plato and a little bit of Socrates and Aristotle. Like these had a huge impact on Christian development during when it was developing in Rome, like a huge impact. So it makes total sense. And so I also like what you said about we make things make sense through our ideas, but they're limiting tools that kind of isolate it, and it's not actually how things work. So it kind of reminds me of Camus and absurdism. At heart, I'm a little bit of an absurdist, so I think everything is innately absurd, and we try to just make sense of it. And it is a system of measurement. So I completely agree on that. I also think that your idea of source is very similar to my idea of source, because source kind of started out and it started out from like from whatever it was, and it became like a baseline of like elements and materials and stuff, and it's becoming more and more complex. So I think that both of our understanding of source is actually not human centric, because I think that a lot of the time humans think that kind of we're the center of the universe, and when something bad happens to humanity, we're like, oh, why is God doing this? Or why is God, obviously we're supposed to be masters of this planet and, maybe the solar system, depending on what you believe. But why is God punishing us? Why is all this suffering happening? But this is life, and it's just happening in nature like all the time. The same amount of cruelty and the same amount of wonder, the same amount of beauty. And I believe we're an extension of nature, was an extension of the Divine Mother in my head, extension of Source. But life is evolving and becoming more complex, and actually becoming more, I don't want to say interesting, but it's becoming more intelligent. It seems like life itself was always going to produce something like human beings. and then we're meant to figure something out and maybe become something else, and life is going to take a lot of different courses. But I see resolution in the complexity and in the interchanging of energies and or ideas, and work all the different cells and working together, and all the different life forms working together. I see something being worked out, and I see progression. It's very much the opposite of kind of, the Christian idea of, we're getting worse and worse ever since Adam and Eve. I believe that we're actually getting better and better. But in Hinduism, there's cycles of time that last thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and consciousness itself goes in cycles. But it's a cycle. It goes in cycles, and it goes up as everything progresses and becomes more developed and works something out, whatever that is. For me, when I look at the world, it seems like everything is trying to work something out. I don't know what that is. I can just guess, but it seems to me evident that all of life is trying to work something out. Like there is an end, there is something trying to be figured out, if that makes sense.
Expressed. Something is trying to be expressed. Like if you think about math, there's functions, right? And when you create a solution, that can be considered an expression. So that's kind of the way I think about it. Like for me, we use math. I don't like, so one big issue I have with math, and this is going to sound crazy, I'm sure, but if the entirety of everything in the universe is one thing, then everything within that universe is a fraction of the whole. So any number above one is irrational in my mind. Like we try to create like the idea that things are whole by themselves, but we're all parts of one whole. So that's not a logical, like you can't reconcile that logically.
That is very Vedantic for sure. That is for sure.
And
I agree.
What I was getting at with that is that when we separate ourselves from the world and create multiplicity through wholeness like that, it creates the idea that we are supposed to be worshipped, that we are the whole beings, that we are we are separate. But I use the system of math, though, like not like if you didn't like take a language, right, like a pattern, and then apply it not where it's used now, but to somewhere else. That's how I use words, right? And words to me are in the Bible it says the word is God. So for me, the ability to express ideas, the ability to relate about concepts, the ability to grow our perspectives is God expressing itself to us. And life itself is expressing God through living. And so I know that we're on opposite sides, with you with the goddess and me with God here, but I think that it's kind of like two sides of the same coin in a way, except there's like a different myriad expressions, because like masculine versus feminine is two different forms of it's still human, but it's just different expressions of humanity, right?
Well, it's funny because like even in Vedanta and for Shaktas, like ultimately we know that it's all baby words. So ultimately for a lot of us, I'd have to say most of us, the Shaktas or Vedantic people in general, ultimately masculine and feminine are kind of illusions. And we just think that the goddess element is more accurate, but ultimately it is not ultimately accurate. So it is accurate as our measuring systems can get. It is accurate.
I mean, if you go back like a billion years, there wasn't any, or like whenever, I don't know how far like the timeline for life is off the top of my head, but I'm sure like, what is it, like 500 million years ago, there was only female cells, and then the male gene split off and became XY, and where there was only XX before. So in the sense that we as men are not the ones who have existed since time immemorial, and our consciousness was constructed from that baseline of femininity, that would make sense to say that women are God, or the God is a woman, because masculinity itself came from women in that sense, even scientifically speaking. So I do understand where you're coming from, but like the thing about that is that a lot of what we create as men is made to impress the women in our society. Like, and sure, there are women who are out there who are creative, but the uniting force that makes makes these ideas become reality is usually a masculine force from my experience and what I've witnessed, right? So I think that worshiping a god for me makes more sense than a goddess because I'm worshiping the creative principle, the ability to imagine something and then make it real.
And that's always been something that's interesting about East versus West is that so in Hinduism, Shakti is the active force in the spine. The active force in the spine is feminine, and which leads to moksha, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. But for Shaktas, the active force is feminine, but in the West, it is universally masculine. And that is definitely the difference between East and West as far as that philosophy goes. And even in most of like the northern half of India, the active principle is masculine. So yeah, that does track for Western thought and for a lot of people's thought for sure.
All right. I was kind of hoping you would go into like what you thought about what is the goddess energy for you? Like, how does it separate from the god energy? Like, I know you said it's kind of like an illusion, there not being a separation, but like the Western concept is a god of creation. The Eastern concept is a goddess of creation or a goddess of everything.
Yeah. So goddesses in general. So some say Shakti. I say Kali. Kali is a creationary, preserving, and destroying force. So usually in Hinduism, you have Brahma, which is creator, masculine, Vishnu, which is preserver, and then Shiva, destroyer. And none of these three are evil; they all are necessary functions. But for Shaktas, all three of those functions are epitomized in Shakti or Kali, and that these forces are different pieces of her different expressions. Because for instance, for God to manifest here, it has to be inherently feminine because it is creation acting within the womb creation. Now that might sound like phallic in general, but it has to come from the feminine to have expression within the womb because of the natural, you could say, of the space of the various wombs that we exist in. It has to be ultimately feminine, but it will be masked with masculine. It will come in the sheath of masculinity, but at its heart, it will be feminine.
I see. Yeah, I had a mental image as you were saying that, like it just popped into my mind of the X chromosome on our XY and it being like the priority, whereas the Y is like the tangent. And that's kind of that's the mental image I got when we were talking about what we were talking about. I think that, it just like if source is our belief, right, that there is a original point in the universe where everything came from, then it would make sense that if women came before men, that they would be, or that God would be a woman. And I think that maybe it's my ego that's preventing me from seeing things that way. I don't know.
I think so. The only thing that I would say is odd is that I don't jump to thinking of God as being masculine or feminine per se. That's not a necessity in my philosophy or ideology. I don't think in my head God is a woman or God is a man. Perhaps the feminine principle underlies my philosophy, but for me, that sheath is far more transparent than it is obvious, if that makes sense. The sheath that I put on the source is more transparent for me than it is obvious, if that makes sense.
So, like the words are just expressions that you don't hold specific meaning to, in a way. Like it's transparent, as in it can be whatever.
I would say it's more translucent. They exist, but it's like clothes. We kind of know what's under the clothes, but it's just clothes.
Right.
I would say that. So for a long time, I kind of got caught up in like logical fallacies or like logical okay, if God created, then what created God? Or if God is all powerful, can he create an immovable object that even he couldn't move? And then but I think that we get trapped in our measuring systems and human logic, and I think that we're boxing ourselves in by us needing it to make sense by the way we understand things. I think
Yes.
that sometimes that gets in the way rather than helping us, and I think that we have to figure out where those boxes are and be willing to see those boxes as not needing to be resolved. Because if we need them to be resolved, then you continually go in a circle into an infinitely small space rather than an expanding space.
It
That makes
sounds
sense.
like what you're saying is that life is more so about experiencing life rather than about creating thoughts about life.
Yeah, I'd say that's fairly accurate as far as how I think.
That makes a lot of sense. I have lived a fairly sedentary life myself. I don't go out much. My room is my monk cell. I do a lot of meditation, a lot of thinking, and for me, it's like, I don't know. Thoughts are just a natural byproduct of experience, and I can see. But like, for me, I don't create thoughts. I don't like sit here and intentionally like I'm gonna think this thing. It's like I experience something, and then the thought is inspired in my mind. So I do
So, do you
agree.
feel like your thoughts are trying to make sense of the experience, or your thoughts are trying to categorize it or figure it out, and then but the experience comes first, but the thoughts are trying to figure the experience out? Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think for me, the thoughts are irrational for me a lot of the time. Like I'll have an experience and then I don't know how it'll relate, but I'll have I'll have a revelation of some kind. It'll be like some great thought. I'm like, I got to share this with someone. And then, but like how it connects to the experience doesn't really there's no clear line there, It's like, how do I put this?
The two Venn diagrams don't overlap to where they become one. They're just connected by a tendril kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Become one.
Exactly. So it's like I'll go out, I'll have these experiences, and then say I'm working on a philosophical model in my head, right? That whatever experience I'm having may contribute to that model that I'm working on in some other corned off part of my brain, and how it's effective and relating to that isn't clear, but going out and experiencing life does improve and grow your mind's ability to create information. So I agree with you there. We're getting to be close to 30 minutes. I just figured, do you want to say anything to wrap up? I think it's been
I'll just say, anybody can find me on YouTube at Hunter Salazar, HUNTER space SALAZAR, and feel free to watch videos or leave comments. Everything helps. And feel free to contact me on Facebook at facebook.com/hunter.salazar, HUNTER SALAZAR. And feel free to reach out. And I would look forward to having future conversations with you, man, and continue our conversations on your channel or mine or both.
Yeah, for sure. If you want to, you can post this video on your channel as well. Once I get it edited and fixed up, my editor is fixing his laptop right now, so my channel is on a little bit of a hold until we get all that figured out.
Sure.
Man, I really appreciate you coming today. Yeah, it was nice to meet you. I'm glad we relate and see things the same way, and I think I'm excited to explore where our beliefs diverge. I think that's where the conversation is going to get really interesting. Right now, I'm still in the early development stages of making the podcast, so I'm still getting the who wants to be a regular, who I'm just interviewing one-off, all figured out. And once I get a few people who are down to have a deeper spiritual discussion, you will definitely be one of the top ones on the list.
I would love that. I'd love to be part of those discussions.
Awesome, brother. Well, namaste. Have a wonderful day.
Have a good one.